So I'm recording this on Sunday night. It probably won't go up on the channel till Monday night. But yeah, recording it on Sunday, and it's been about 24 hours after Dillian Whyte versus Minto and Anthony Joshua versus Gary Cornish. Now, instantaneously I did videos after those two fights, probably up within the first hour, and I put down my initial thoughts. Now, I won't go over in depth what I said in those videos, because they're online. They're only uploaded 2 or 3 days ago. So you can watch those if you're interested in my immediate thoughts. But let's just say those were thoughts straight away off the bat, without any deeper reflection. And to summarise briefly, I said Dillian Whyte was a 6 out of 10 performance. He looked defensively weak and not very clinical, quite clumsy. And that Anthony Joshua put in a very, very good performance, albeit against not much of an opponent. I've now reflected on it for 24 hours, and my thoughts on this fight keep changing. And I think that's when you have a really interesting fight ahead of you, Dillian Whyte versus Anthony Joshua, when you can't truly make up your own mind as to who's going to win. And I've flip-flopped several times in the build-up to this fight as to which direction I see it going in and who I really fancy to get the W on the night. When it was announced, when it was first rumoured to be made, I had Anthony Joshua an overwhelming favourite in my mind. The thought behind it was the timing was right for Joshua. Joshua seemed to have developed into more of a professional heavyweight boxer. Joshua was more technical, Joshua was more clinical. Now, up till about just before the fights last night, Dillian Whyte was building and building and building into my mind. I'm pretty sure that I can say I truly bought into his hype, bought into some of the build-up. He looked good on the Sky Show when he fought Beto Acosta Jr. And in my mind, this had gone from a fight where I had Anthony Joshua as an 80% favourite to now one that was viewing 50-50. Could Dillian Whyte get inside? Could Dillian Whyte get into Joshua's head? Could Dillian Whyte take Joshua into deep water and make him go rounds he's never gone before? Would Joshua's chin live up to Whyte's power? There were so many questions that I was starting to see it as a 50-50 fight. Now for me, last night, the fight reverted from 50-50 to 80-20 in favour of Joshua. And that opinion initially was probably flagged in the 2 videos that I put up straight after. Dillian Whyte seemed to have some sort of injury. He seemed to be slightly awkward. His punches weren't very clean. He was smothering his work. And as I say, his punches were wide and he was defensively open. And I thought if a fighter like Minto is able to hit you and to capitalise on defensive frailties, what is a fighter like Anthony Joshua going to do to you? So, when I put those 2 videos last night, it's fair to say that, I was back in the sort of 80% Joshua, 20% Whyte camp. Now, on reflection, and having thought about it a lot over the last 24 hours, and I've been on a train for 3 hours today, so, certainly a lot of reflection time. I'm now thinking that this is back to a pretty tight matchup. I'm not going to say 50-50, because after the performances last night, I do make Joshua a favourite. This is not a 50-50 fight now, in my opinion. But I'm seeing it as something like 60-40, 65-35. And I'll tell you what, Joshua did look impressive last night. And it's fair to say that Joshua has looked that impressive in the vast majority of his professional outings. Joshua looked really, really good. But without being a hater, we've got to look at 2 facts. The performances against Gary Cornish and Kevin Johnson, whilst they were visually very impressive performances, they still don't answer any questions about Anthony Joshua. Because let's be honest, we know Joshua hits very hard. That's not up for debate. That's a fact. Joshua is a big, big puncher. But they still haven't asked any of the questions about Joshua. What Joshua is like when he's hit on the chin. What's his stamina like if he has to go a few rounds? What's his defence like? What's his inside game like? What's his back foot like? Joshua was able to get through these fights without having to answer those questions. And credit to him. But as I've said before, and I'll say it again, it's not always good when a fighter gets through all these fights without having to answer those questions. Because when you do that, it puts you in a David Price type situation where you end up fighting someone who's top 10 in the world, Tony Thompson, and then you have to answer those questions against a class opponent without the relevant prep. So Joshua destroying these opponents is great. He's right. You don't get paid for overtime. But does this mean that when he steps up to fight a class opponent, he's going to be ill-prepared and he's not going to have the professional, competitive experience? And as I say, all of those things that he hasn't proved. So these performances, these devastating early knockouts, yeah, they're eye-catching. But all they're doing is confirming what I already know, that he's a big puncher. And they're not actually letting us answer any questions of him whatsoever. Yeah, as I say, there's still so many intangibles and unknowns about Joshua's game. And I won't keep going over it, but as I say, defence, chin, inside game, back foot game, stamina. You know, he's being hyped as the greatest prospect in the world, and, you know, a sure thing to win the heavyweight belt. I mean, how many other fighters would you be so confident to become a world champion? But, you know, you're unsure of their defence or their chin or their stamina. You know, for me, it's still very, very early days with Anthony Joshua. So that's the first dampener I'll put on, is that in these performances, whilst they've been very visually exciting and pleasing, he hasn't actually answered any questions. Secondly, if we actually look at the form here, beating Gary Cornish means literally nothing from a form perspective. I'm into my horse racing. I don't know if any of the subscribers to this channel will be interested in horse racing, but sometimes you'll see it where one horse has won 3 races on the bounce, and the other horse has got, you know, no form at all. It's come 7th, it's come 8th, it's come 9th, but it's been running in a much higher class. You know, its trainer has put it into a big money race, sent it to a, you know, big Group 1 or Group 2 event, and it's come 7th. And you've got this other horse who's been running in Selling Company or Claiming Company or Maiden Company, and it's picked up a few wins back to back. And you'll often see in the bookmakers, the horse who's got 3 wins back to back is a huge favourite, and a horse with no form, you know, is a big price. And what you'll often find is the horse who's routinely come 8th and 9th, but in the high class company, actually destroys the horse who's won a load of races at a lower grade. What I'm getting at is a fighter who performs at a high level consistently, even if it's not necessarily winning form, can sometimes be a stronger measure of form and a way of giving a prediction than just a fighter who continuously wins. In my mind, Gary Cornish is not a top 100 heavyweight based on his form and based on the opponents that he's beaten. In my mind, he would fall below a Kevin Johnson based on the level of competition he's operated at. You know, Kevin Johnson, don't get me wrong, he's not a top 30, not a top 40 heavyweight, but he's fought Klitschko and went the distance with Klitschko. He's went the distance with Fury. He actually beat and stopped Alex Leopai. You know, he's got some form at relevant levels that Cornish doesn't have. You know, beating Cornish means very, very little from a form perspective. Very little. Cornish, in 3 or 4 years' time, we could look back at this Joshua versus Cornish fight, and that form could be no more worthwhile than when David Price beat what's the name of the chap? God, this is going to annoy me now. David Price beat an undefeated 6 foot something heavyweight. This is really going to annoy me. He recently got stopped by Charles Martin. Do you know what? I'm just going to have to go on my phone and check this because it's really frustrating me. But what I'm getting at is another example is when Lucas Brown beat Richard Towers. You know, Richard Towers was this undefeated guy who was 6'8", 6'9", or 6'6". You know, he's a massive guy. You take the point. You know, with an undefeated record, and Lucas Brown was able to walk through him with relative ease. The guy I was talking about, David Price, fighting, let me just look it up now, is Tom Dallas. Tom Dallas was 15-0. Tom Dallas was, 6'5", 6'6", viewed as a prospect. Yeah, what I'm getting at is in 2 years' time, Gary Cornish might have got stopped by 3 or 4 other people, not really got on to much. And Anthony Joshua beating Gary Cornish is the same as when David Price beat Tom Dallas, or the same as when Lucas Brown beat Richard Towers. Unbeaten opponents, decent knockout percentages because they've been operating at a low level, huge guys, but fundamentally poor fighters at this kind of level. And I think there's every possibility that this form amounts to that, because I think Gary Cornish is poor. I think his padded record has flattered him to the extreme. I just don't think he's got any power at the elite level, or any stamina. Sorry, not stamina, or any chin. And I also felt yesterday he was quite easy to hit, quite easy to time. And to be fair, Joshua did a good job of timing him and stopping him. Credit where credit's due. But my point is, from a form perspective, this fight means nothing. In terms of lesson learned, this fight means nothing. All that Joshua's done is shown that he's got power against an irrelevant opponent with an irrelevant resume. And he hasn't done it in a way that's impressive. He hasn't mixed it up. Joshua hasn't done what Tyson Fury did. When Tyson Fury fought Martin Rogan, similar level of opponent, Fury comes out. He experiments a bit fighting southpaw. He fights on the inside, he fights on the back foot. He shows different strings to his bow. Joshua hasn't shown it that way. He's just reaffirmed that he's a big puncher. He's just, at this stage, Anthony Joshua has done nothing more than David Price pre-Tony Thompson. Big guys, ex-Olympians, hit hard, can hurt you, can stop you, quite robotic. That's all he's shown. That's all he's shown. Now, it looks like Joshua's got high upside. It looks like he could go on to be a top fighter. But we'll never know until he steps up in opposition. And the fear could be, as it was with David Price, that because he hasn't been adequately tested, because he hasn't gone rounds, because he hasn't had to develop other elements of his game, like we've just discussed, that when he does step up in class, he might find himself in deep water very, very quickly. So that's my first thoughts, and that's why I'm tempering my initial enthusiasm on Anthony Joshua's performance. Let's change it up a bit. Let's talk Dillian Whyte versus Brian Minto. Dillian Whyte struggled in that fight. He apparently had an injury. He tactically had 10 days to prepare for Brian Minto. I think one of my regular Twitter friends tweeted that to me, so fair play to him. But he, so Dillian, he only had 10 days to prepare tactically. He was carrying an injury. It was probably the hardest opponent he'd ever faced. And he actually struggled in places in this fight. Not struggled in a sense that it looked like he was going to lose, or it looked like he was getting hurt. But he didn't look super good. He didn't look super refined. He looked like the step up had found some gaps in his game. Clearly, Jonathan Banks is going to be working with him on defence, on getting those punches a bit straighter. There are areas for improvement. And it's quite easy at first to look back at that fight and say, oh, Dillian Whyte's not going to do anything against Anthony Joshua. Look at these flaws in his game. But having reflected on it for 24 hours, what I'm now thinking is, Dillian Whyte knows some flaws in his game, and he's got 3 months to train those and prepare for what he's going to do next time those flaws are examined. Whereas Anthony Joshua, we haven't seen those flaws yet in him. Of course, every fighter has flaws. The best fighters of all time, Floyd Mayweather, Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Robinson, whoever you want to call them, any of those guys have flaws. Anthony Joshua, not saying that he can't be an all-time great, but he does have flaws, because everyone does. Now, Dillian Whyte has shown his flaws. Can those flaws be trained out? Can he improve in areas of weakness over the next 3 months? Can he bring in sparring to make some tactical adjustments? Possibly. The fact that he struggled, what I'm getting at is the fact that he struggled is perhaps not a negative. Yeah, he's not a finished article right now, but he's shown in fights that, I'm not saying Brian Minto's a relevant puncher. He's a blown-up cruiserweight with limited power. But Dillian Whyte's shown he can take a punch at a certain level. Anthony Joshua hasn't. And, Dillian Whyte can move on from that, can learn from that. And the other thing I wanted to come on to, from a form perspective, is some of Dillian Whyte's form is actually easier to measure than Anthony Joshua's. Because even though he looked poor against Brian Minto went 7 with Joseph Parker, whereas Dillian Whyte got him out in 3. Joseph Parker went 4 of 5 with Beto Costa Jr., I think, whereas Dillian Whyte got him out in 1. And Joseph Parker is a very, very big puncher. So Dillian Whyte's form, because Brian Minto is let's say Brian Minto is a top 100 guy. I personally would rate Brian Minto above Gary Cornish. Dillian Whyte's opponent, Brian Minto, he's the horse I was talking about, who's come 7th, 8th and 9th in the higher company. Brian Minto is not a guy who comes with a load of impressive wins, but he's got measurable form at a certain level. And Dillian Whyte's performance against Brian Minto arguably compares favourably to some of the other fighters who've had it on with Brian Minto. So that's the first thing I'd say on that front. Dillian Whyte's gone in against a relevant journeyman contender type fighter, and he's got him out of there swiftly. He's struggled with the fight because psychologically, having an opponent pull out, he's probably not been the most motivated. He's had 10 days to prepare for the new opponent. It's a step up in class for him, and he's carrying an injury. So there's lots of room for improvement for Dillian Whyte. He can come on for this fight. He can show. He can really show why what I'm getting at is, I expect Dillian Whyte to be better in December than he was in September. Hopefully he won't come into the fight with an injury. Hopefully he'll have a lot more time to tactically prepare for his opponent. And most importantly, there's obvious areas that Jonathan Banks will have seen from his fight that he can improve on. Now with Anthony Joshua, what's he going to do if Dillian Whyte's still there after 3 or 4 rounds? What's he going to do if Dillian Whyte hits him back? What's he going to do if Dillian Whyte puts him up on his back foot or fights him on the inside? Fights dirty. What I'm getting at is, we're starting to see questions being posed against Dillian Whyte. In my opinion, we're still yet to see those questions being posed against Anthony Joshua. And I don't think it's ideal preparation that Joshua is first going to answer those questions when he steps into the ring against Dillian Whyte. Don't get me wrong, the performances last night, visually Anthony Joshua, much more impressive. But from a form perspective, it could be that in a year down the line, the Brian Minto fight is more worthwhile form. Minto is a fighter who's consistently performed at a certain level, and Dillian Whyte handled him well. 6 out of 10 to 7 out of 10 well. Essentially, despite taking a few punches and being a bit wide, Dillian Whyte was able to hurt him and stop him quickly. Whereas Anthony Joshua's form could be as irrelevant as when David Price chinned Tom Dallas. Because for me, Gary Cornish, I've seen nothing from Cornish to suggest he's better than Tom Dallas. So, what I'm getting at, and the reason I've made this video, and I've rambled on for long enough now, so fair play to you if you're still with me and you've followed it into this, but what I'm getting at is, I, like everyone else, and I say like everyone else, based purely on the comments I received on my video, the statements people have made, like everyone else, I feel that I fell into the trap of instantly buying into Anthony Joshua's win over Gary Cornish. But having considered it and having reflected on it, is Dillian Whyte stopping an opponent in 3 rounds who is a proven trial horse at a certain level, whilst Dillian had an injury and limited time to prepare? Isn't that actually more impressive than blowing out someone who's never had a proper fight in 1 round when you've had 3 or 4 months notice for the fight? In my opinion, whilst Dillian Whyte had a harder job, that harder job will actually be better preparation for the big fight than Anthony Joshua. And whilst, just based on the eye test, I think Anthony Joshua is the favourite, I'm still not ruling Dillian Whyte out. And right now, I'm saying it's 60-40 in favour of Anthony Joshua. Let me know your thoughts. I'm sure we'll discuss this fight many times en route to December. Look forward to the build-up, and I'm buzzing for this one. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please do give me a thumbs up.